At the end of the 18th century, the French Navy built 4 large frigates, only 2 of which were 24-pounders. The Forte and the sister ship, the Egyptian, this is, of course, the Forte, and these were 2 24-pounders. The others were 18-pounders, and we ignore them. These were designed both to carry 30 24-pounders on the main deck. As it turned out, the Egyptian only mounted 28 of those 24-pounders for reasons we don't know. The number 1 gun ports at the bow would not fit them, and it's never been explained. So she carried 28. She also carried 14 8-pounders on the quarterdeck and the foredeck. Very quickly, she was 189 feet from figurehead to taffrail, which translates in the model to 14 1/4 inches. We'll come to that in a moment. Her width was at the broadest point was 42.5 feet, and she displaced 2,125 gross tons, and had a crew totaling with officers of 450. Very brief recap also of her history. She was launched in 1799. Her first assignment was in 1801 when she was directed to sail to Alexandria to resupply the French troops that Napoleon had abandoned in Egypt that were fighting the British and the Turks. And she made it to Alexandria, and shortly thereafter was blockaded by a British squadron. And after that, in August of 1801, the French finally surrendered to the British and Turks. And as part of that surrender, she was turned over to the British Navy. And the little quirk in all of this, where she basically had a very good life for about 8 years. The quirk in all of this was that when she was turned over, she had on board the Rosetta Stone, which went to London as a consequence, and is how it ended up there. Ironically, though, ultimately the hieroglyphics were translated by a Frenchman, so you never know about these things. And I've been asked by so-called friends if I intended to include a copy of the Rosetta Stone in the model, and the answer is no. Okay. So this is the model set in front of a brig of the same vintage, and it's a pretty good illustration of how big this ship was, and how a brig, albeit one that mounted carronades, fairly substantial carronades, would have no chance. Couldn't get close enough to use the carronades, would have been blown out of the water by the 24-pounders alone on that ship. Interesting question, since she was launched in 1799, whether she or her sister ship were in any way an inspiration for the American heavy frigates or the British heavy frigates, and we don't know. But we do know that she was highly regarded as an effective sailing and fighting vessel, and was well known. So it's certainly a possibility that she might have provided some inspiration to other navies. To the construction of the model, the problem that I always run into in doing solid hull models, normally with a bread and butter construction, is how do you deal with the upper works? I do a solid hull below, usually a basswood, usually bread and butter. And then you have the problem of, well, how do you get those upper works installed on that? And so in this case, I decided to try it a little bit differently. And so this was my solution. I took about half of the frames, there are about 75 frames on the original, took about half of them and created these modules that consist of 2 semi-frames that are accurate on the outsides and accurate on the upper portion of the inside. And as you can see, they're just rough finished below that. And they have the slots or mortises for the gun ports, the ledges on the gun ports. And then I set these in pairs with a thickness of basswood between them that was sanded to the exact thickness of the gunports, and also carried the camber for the gundeck with it. And so the front and rear, I don't have my pointer here, but the front and rear of these modules both have gunports, and the middle between them is just a single frame and some additional pieces of basswood to properly separate those gunports. Fortunately, on this ship, the gunports were mounted directly off the frames and not offset as they are on many ships. And so that made this process easy. And so basically I built it up using these modules for the 15 gunports that were on the ship, and mounted it for building purposes in this frame. This is a piece of what we call MDF. I'm not sure what it's called elsewhere, but medium density fiberboard. So the whole comes together and forms the ship, but without the bread and butter, rather it's vertical. And so then the ends are formed traditionally as bread and butter. Now what I've done here is added a series of blocks because I prefer to plank upside down. And of course that would, if I didn't have these blocks, it would damage the frame extensions. And so this is added to mount it. And so I begin the planking. Now below the whales, I'm planking with pearwood, Swiss pear. Just a note on, my ships all have the same woods, which is Swiss pear, gaboon ebony, and boxwood. And I just happen to prefer to work with these woods, and I think they work very nicely. The Swiss pear in particular bends and shapes very nicely. So there's the lower planking completed, and it's still mounted on the box pieces. I don't use a finish on them. What appears to be shiny, it's fairly shiny, is sanding down to some very, very fine 12,000 grit sandpaper. And ultimately, I prefer this to a finish, but of course you can also use oil and various other things. We're dealing with about, as I recall, 35 strakes per side. And of course, they're made up of multiple sections, 5, generally 4 or 5 per length of the ship. So clamping at this scale is an issue. And after a lot of trial and error, I came up with these wonderful little lag screws that I had in my possession for many years and hadn't really used for anything. And drilling a small hole and using the lag screws, I'm able to do the planking, I think, quite effectively. And I just happen to have a picture of the planks of the lag screws with the lag screw driver, which I have no idea where it came from. But so now with the lower planking done, I'm going to reverse the ship, put it upright for the upper planking. And for this, I put threaded brass rods in, which will ultimately be the base for the, ultimately be the center of the stanchions, which will support it. But at this point, I mount it onto a base, which is built up from MDF boards and has a center slot, which allows me to mount these threaded rods. I use some sheets of brass as kind of a washer. Now we're on to the ebony whales. Interesting, again, this is gaboon ebony. It does bend if it's thin enough. As a general rule, for the bow and stern elements, I'm going to use a thinner piece of ebony mounted behind it, a piece of pearwood. So I gain the thickness without having to try to bend thick ebony, which would be very difficult. But the thin ebony with a little alcohol and heat will bend, just takes patience and time, and ends up working okay. In addition to the base that I showed you, the MDF base, which is kind of in the background there, I also use a slanted thing that I created. I'm not sure what to call it, but it allows me to work on either the outside when it's aimed in the right direction, or the inside. This shows me working on the inside. It's angled down towards me, but then for planking, it can be flipped over to the other side. On the subject of the lower wails, or the lower planking rather, I didn't use tree nails. I have done it in the past, but it's an aesthetic decision. Putting tree nails, first of all, I happen to like the look of the planking as I had done it. And second of all, that many tree nails, you're talking about, as I said, 75 frames doubled. It detracts, I think, from the overall look in this instance. And so I avoided it. However, on the upper planking above the whale, I did put tree nails, or indicate tree nails. These are done generally by using a pin that is ground down to a straight point, chucked into a handle of some kind, and then used to press into the wood. And then I use a wax, generally a furniture repair wax of a darker color, to rub over it, and that creates the look that I happen to like. I also know there's a distortion in the color of this photographs. The boxwood is much lighter, is not as yellow as it appears here, but that's just it. Now, while I'm on this slide, the next slide had an interesting feature of this ship. The two gun ports, or 4 gun ports, in the aft cabin, captain's quarters, had additional glass frames mounted in them that were removable, but allowed the cannon to extend out and thus not take up quite as much room in the cabin itself, and allow light in without having the, I guess, nuisance of air coming through. In any case, I've seen this on several French ships. I'm not sure about British, but they're very interesting. And of course, they clip on and are quickly removed for use in action. So now to the bow. A couple of interesting points here. I'll have some other slides that'll show it a little better, but just starting with the various decorative elements, the cheeks and so forth. And at the top, you see the beginnings of the frames for the gratings. And I do these as you would do any gratings, which is to use a table saw with a thin blade to create the slots in a wide piece of wood, and then sand and shape the piece of wood to fit the bow. It's a bit tedious, but it does produce a pretty accurate base for the gratings. So there are 3 head rails at the head. These are the upper head rails, which have a interesting form and are made up of several different pieces. And this, I'm sorry, the slide is foggy, but I've got a better one coming up. But this shows the 3 sets of head rails as mounted. It also shows on the left the anchor pad, and it also shows the gun port, the #1 gun port, which I leave closed since it's empty. Also, if you straight in the middle, below the cheek, is an interesting feature I've not seen elsewhere, though it must exist, which is an iron pipe that extends down from the upper works, and it is an intake pipe for a pump, which presumably was used to, among other things, clean out the heads. The pump will be mounted after the decking is put in. It's protected here by a wooden batten, since it's below, of course, the waterline. And so that's a wooden batten over an iron pipe. So this shows an upper view of the same area. I've now added the base for the gratings, and you can see in the center the first two gratings on either side, one wide and one narrow. And then the next slide will show a better, I think, picture of that. Well, no, it doesn't. It just shows the complexity of this thing. And what's interesting is the three headrails, each one is different, which is a bit unusual. So the top headrail that I showed you, the long one, and then below that is a round or slightly oval rail. And then below that is a rail with some decorative feature on it. And so this whole process was involved, to say the least. And as this picture was taken, it's still not completed. I'm still sanding and touching up portions of it, but this does give a good idea of the complexity and the decorative nature of the head. And now I have the grating in. Fortunately, these are very thin, so I was able to create the curve simply by finger pressure and putting them as I put them in. Okay, so much for the heads. A 24-pounder gun. This is uses the interesting French technique, which I talked about before a bit. The breeching runs not to the cascabel button, but through the carriage itself, through a hole in the carriage. And you know, whether this is better than what every other Navy used, I don't know, but it is consistent throughout the French Navy. Now, a note on my cannon: for reasons that I can never explain or justify, I want brass used for my cannon. Again, I have no explanation except that's what I like. I've tried other materials and I've just never been satisfied with them. So the issue then is, how do you make brass cannon at this scale? You can make a master and have them cast. I had that done once. I found a jeweler who would work in brass. Most of them will not. And that was, he did a very good job. It was very expensive. And at the end of the day, at this scale, you end up filing off flash and risking some of the fine details as you do that. It's very, very difficult to get it done right. And so at the end of the day, I decided I've got to turn them. And the problem with turning is that although I have a very fine Sherline lathe, no one makes any kind of a duplicating device that really works with it. And the other problem with duplicating devices is that they tend to blur detail. It's very difficult to get one to actually do the detail. So what I end up doing is turning them in sections. And this one doesn't have the front portion, but gives you an idea of how it's done. And what I've found is with a good indicator dial, and I'm able to do repetitive turnings of sections that actually move along fairly well once you have the measurements in. And so in the end, this is a not inefficient way of producing cannon. It is not as efficient as casting, perhaps, but it does work for me and does allow me to have the brass cannon that I desire for no explicable reason. And here are just some of them stuck in a piece of clay to sit. They're joined usually by epoxy. And again, I don't have the front portion of it, but this gives a pretty good idea of the aft section. This is a piece of the side tackle for one of the guns and the measurements above. I ended up at 1/160 scale. I've said this before because it's the smallest scale that I can work in there, where I can create working blocks. Anything smaller than this, and Philip Reed and some of those really talented people who work in 1/92nd scale, but they can't use, in most instances, working blocks. And I really believe that this is essential for a good look on the ship. So I make working blocks. And as I said, these are side tackles. So here is one of the 24-pounders in place. For this ship, it's interesting. You can see 3 ring bolts or rings surrounding it on the deck. And those were used as tie downs for heavy weather or any other reason to tie the guns down. I've not seen that on many other ships. And you see also the cannonball. I think John asked me about these. These are steel micro ball bearings. And, the world of the internet, you go online and you can find pretty amazing things. And I did not know before I went looking that people made steel micro ball bearings, but there they are. And I've got a lot of them painted. Okay, so the French did not use the Brody stoves that the British were fond of. They built these things. This is about 6 feet tall and about 6 feet cube, maybe a little bit different in the other dimensions, but roughly that. And it is a wood shell, which is fitted with firebrick. And there are 2 sides to it. The larger one, which is facing you, was for the crew, and the opposite side was for officers. And in front of that are some racks for spits. And basically, they cooked it pretty much the same way as the British. They used coppers, and the coppers would sit on the grates. And below the grates you would load coal or wood. The board directly in front of that slides out to enable that to be done. And there are hooks and various implements for doing other sorts of cooking. I have no idea what was involved, but this is how they did it on the larger vessels. They also had a bread oven, but that was on the orlop deck, so it doesn't get shown in this. And here is the stove mounted in place. Now we're on the officer's side, which is a little shallower, and some of the other elements. Now, I have to explain at this point, there will be decking, foredeck in this instance, over this, and a lot of this will disappear and be only seen in glimpses from what I'll show you later is the angle that you can see it. But because I wasn't entirely sure what could be seen and what couldn't be seen, I went ahead and put in a fair amount of the detail. The 2 vertical elements that aren't painted, that are right behind or forward of the stove or the oven, are rotating pillars. Again, the tops of these things aren't shown because they will be well hidden. But these are rotating pillars which allowed the cable, anchor cable and messenger to avoid running into the stove. And you'll see there's another set further down. Okay, so this is an overview looking aft. You can see, of course, the capstan. The stairs on the right are the officers' stairs, which are less steep and wider than those available to the crew. The 12 painted pillars that you see, again, they don't have their tops because they will be covered by the decking, but they were supports that were mounted to the overhead beams with hinges, and they would lift up in a fore and aft direction to allow the use of the capstan, which otherwise you couldn't use with them in place. So you had the necessary pillar support for the upper deck, but it was removable, as it were. I think that there's a officer's storeroom behind the stair to the right, where food supplies for the officers were stored, and of course the aft cabin is there as well. To the far left are those two additional pillars that are used to protect the various elements from the messenger and if necessary the anchor cable. And this is the forward end again. Now there are two spare top masts that are mounted on the deck, and there are the 4 stairs which access the gangways and the upper decks. Those were a little tricky, I have to say. They have a slightly pyramidal shape as you face them, slightly angled, and the treads all extended beyond the face of the stringers. So they had to be formed, not only cut to shape against the stringers, but each one was a different width. So that was frankly, a lot of handwork involved in that. I don't have my pointer, but what you see there is the opening section where actually there are chocks for ship's boats to be mounted, and the gangways on either side, the fore and aft decking. The only thing that will be visible is that center oblong section. Yes. And so on this scale, there's very little of the deck that you can see. I can't tell you exactly what you can see, so in an abundance of caution, I think you can see just the bottom part of the officer's stairway, but I went ahead and put it all in because I was having fun, I think. And what will be seen will be seen. We'll find out once I start to do the next level of decking. And this is as she is today. I've just started to work on the ship's decorations, which are primarily at the stern. You haven't seen anything of the stern because there's really nothing to show yet. But there's a fair amount of decoration on the stern and a little bit at the head, which will come. And hopefully I will have a chance in the future to show you that, hopefully with a PowerPoint that I can actually use.